Greetings, my friends. This is Arcanus, and as you may be able to tell, I am joined here today by a special guest. This is my friend Matthew, who I've enjoyed many TTRPG related conversations with. He is someone that, as you can tell by the vast quantity of material in front of him, is very familiar with the tabletop role playing scene. And this led eventually to him, in fact, creating his own company where he publishes some TTRPGs called Flourish and Fate. So far, the game that he's published is Dybbuks and Dreidels, as seen here. And he has many other systems in the works. So I'm just going to find out more about how he got to this point of starting a game company, why he did it, and just all the vast knowledge that you have at your disposal about role-playing games. What is this game system that you made, and how did it work?
Dybbuks and Dreidels is a rules light, narrative first game, much more in the collaborative storytelling side than much like crunchier games with a combat system like D&D. The biggest thing that makes it different is that you use dreidels instead of dice to make resolutions. Dreidels take about 8 seconds to resolve instead of dice, which are almost instantaneous. So I use those 8 seconds to be like, oh, that's when your help actions happen. Like, people are encouraged to be a little fast on that. I've started with some systems that are in the Powered by the Apocolypse family. That is a style of storytelling games. The first one, Apocalypse Worlds, came out in 2010. Took the indie RPG world by storm. It feels like every single indie game is powered by the Apocalypse now, or at least learn from it. And so some of the things it does is it has the GM doesn't actually touch dice, or in this case, dreidels. It's all player-focused action, which is good. I put a little bit of like arguing with God as like a main mechanic in this. So when you take an action that might be risky, the GM then says, okay, here's what I think would be the consequence if you fail. And you argue about what the successes will be if you succeed, what the failures will be
Right.
if you fail.
It uses a little bit of kind of like
Yeah.
I would say one of the components that TTRPGs can be used in terms of a therapeutic context also, which is just that actions have consequences tied to them. And
Yes.
in some games, this doesn't happen as naturally, especially if the system isn't built to do that. But this is a system where, I mean, I can say from my own experience of playing it, it is very much naturally lended to, if you do X, there will be Y additional like consequence or thing that happens as a result.
Yes. I really was inspired by the Forged in the Dark systems of games done by Blades in the Dark, which is in 2015. Lots and lots of indie games that also like take those rules and play a lot with it. Which on every role you sort of have that talk with the GM, and I decided to play with that. So with that, I think another big thing is that you don't have a character sheet. Everyone has 3. If I had read, other games, then I would have called them tags, but I call them attributes. And you just write 3 adjectives or nouns that every single action you take is going to, be based off of. So that makes it really easy to set up and, very easy to make characters.
I guess just also so we don't get too far before we explain a little bit of the context. For those of you who might not know what a dreidel is, what would you say a dreidel is?
A dreidel is a 4-sided spinning top that is associated with the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah that has 4 letters on it. And you play a game that is a little bit betting. You have these, now we use chocolate coins. We use the word geld, which just means money in Yiddish. And you put some into the pot in the middle, you spin it, and it tells you 4 different actions that you could take. You could take the whole pot in the middle, you could take half the pot, you could do nothing, or you could, be forced to put some of your own in the middle.
And these mechanics kind of directly tie into the entire playing mechanic of the game itself.
Yes. Yeah. Specifically, because I know some of these words are unfamiliar, I decided to put some commentary on the sides. And specifically, the Talmud is a major work of Jewish law codes that sort of has a center and then various commentaries on the side. So I used one of them to do a lot of that explanation, and the other one to give people a lot of here's an example of how people are playing it, sort of tied to the rule that's on the page, so that for people who want the imagination of seeing hey, how does this look in action rather than what are instructions for it.
Yeah.
You could do that.
So you don't need to be familiar with Jewish culture or Jewish folklore in order to play this game.
A glossary at the back of every single word from Hebrew or Yiddish or Aramaic in the back.
Which is very helpful. And a lot of game systems that I've encountered do not do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this game, even if you're not familiar with these cultures and folklore components, there is commentary and indices and things like that to help you learn still how to implement and play the game. Of course, if you are already familiar with those things, it might come a little bit more naturally, or you might pick up on some interesting choices like with the font or the formatting, like you pointed out, and have a, oh, that's pretty cool type moment.
I've done it with people with almost no Jewish knowledge, and they thought the format was so creative and loved the idea of having the commentary on the sides. And meant that the rules got to be much more streamlined, because if I wanted to make a point about, say, here's actually the thought that I had going into this, I could put it in the commentary on the side and still give that to people without it bogging everything down.
So you were mentioning the different attributes that you would have when you're making a character.
Yes.
So what would an example of a character look like?
An example might be you take 3 of the 6 D&D attributes and just have strength and charisma and wisdom or something. It could also be, I think the funniest is one of our friends decided to just say hard-boiled egg. And she just took some action saying, how could a hard-boiled egg be used in this case? I have a whole bunch of other things in there. If you want to play a character with a specific backstory and your backstory into every single thing, you might say, I was a baker for this time, or, my aging mother, and
right.
Yeah, tie everything into how this action is related to your mother.
Right. And you have several example characters in the book as well, from what I recall.
Oh, absolutely. I think 15 example characters.
Something like that. Yeah. So, even for folks who might not have a strong idea going into it, like what they might want for a character, there are ones that you can just take and start playing with. Some folks who are familiar with RPGs in general might know a golem, which has a Jewish cultural origin. And so there is a character, I believe, in the book, which is just a golem. So you can choose 3 different traits that be associated with a golem, like protection or strength or being made out of clay, perhaps.
Yes. I think another thing about Dybbuks and Dreidels is that the first third that you're doing is the collaborative world building. I just go into every single session sort of with a 2-word pitch, a 2-sentence pitch, I should say. And from that 2-sentence pitch, I ask everyone at the table, what's something true about the world? How does your character fit into it? And the collaborative world building is 1/3 of the game. And I think that's a lot of the feedback I gotten about what makes it feel so special.
Yeah. I would agree. I think the collaborative world building, I would say, of the games that I've played, definitely has the most collaborative world building of the systems that I've taken part in. I don't know if you've encountered ones that are even more so than that.
Microscope RPG is entirely the collaborative world building and nothing else. I love Microscope. I don't know if it's an RPG, but it calls itself one. And then Dialect, which I have over here, is you're building a context for how sociolinguistics can happen. So the first half of it is just building what your community is, and the second half is making individual words tied to how your community is different. Right. So that has even more collaborative world building.
Yeah. And folks might be familiar with the collaborative world building from part 2 of my session 0 video, where I talked about just in general how
Yeah.
GMs should be incorporating players into the decision of how to create a world, whether it is, oh, my character has so and so origin and how to fit that into the world. And so this takes that up to 11, so to speak, by making it like, oh, everyone has a very direct role in like what the world even is,
Mm,
what it is that the characters are doing, what's like the whole plot and motivation.
mhm.
You're like starting town, so to speak. So, what got you to decide this is how you wanted to make a game focused around dreidels?
So it started at some offhanded conversations I had over Hanukkah about how the game of Dreidel is not a very good game because, again, it takes 8 seconds to do these four actions that you don't really have any choice in it. And it might have been Arcanus, it might have been a different friend mentioned, well, can you use it as a D4 for playing D&D? And I mentioned the same thing about it not being as instantaneous as dice. Um, and then I said, you know what? I'm going to make a system that uses that 8 seconds as an important part of it. So I use it as a timer. Like, someone's being slow, you could point at them and say something bad's going to happen if you don't, do it before this dreidel falls down. I like the idea of starting in medias res and like, games. You say, here's the scene, here's like the brief outline, let's roll dice and see, do we start already like, we're winning in the fight with the goblins, we're losing in the fight with the goblins, so that the scene is not just here's an empty field, let's play on it.
Right. So it becomes more of a series of scenes,
Yeah,
almost like a book or a movie,
yeah,
than it does
yeah,
a, I guess, more like a traditional RPG or TTRPG
yeah,
where it's just like, okay, everyone's taking one turn after another in the middle of combat.
yeah.
And, you know, what might be a 2-minute scene ends up taking like an hour.
Yes. And I think that there is absolutely a place for those more simulationist ones, but this sort of like short vignettes gets you through something if you want to have, Dybbuks and Dreidels is made for one shots. And one of my big design principles was everything has to be done so that you could feel like you're getting a lot done in, a 1 hour session or something like that.
So, what are the game pieces you would say that someone needs in order to play Dybbuks and Dreidels?
You need a few dreidels. You need some index cards. You could fill them out beforehand if you want to assign people various attributes, or you could get a pencil and write your own down. And then you put various, I use gelts, which are chocolate coins, to keep track. But if you do poker chips, I've done one where we had little plates, that we wrote all of the attributes on and used M&Ms. And it's all theater of the mind. It's, very, very simple pieces. And if you don't have a dreidel, I made an online dreidel spinner that like has those 8 seconds built in.
Which also
Yeah.
can make it more accessible for,
Yeah.
some folks who
Mm.
might not be able to also write things down, or they can't spin a dreidel for
Yeah,
whatever
no,
reason.
because it is hard for arthritis, like at some points, to do the motion of spinning. So
Right.
I, I, I do try to think of accessibility when I can.
Yeah. I'm always a proponent of having more accessibility in games.
Mhm.
So that being said, how does like the gelt or the betting or things like that actually get incorporated into the mechanics of the game?
The mechanics are you do an action that might be a little bit risky, and the GM says, I think that this action is coming from this attribute of yours. The gelt is stored on the attributes and says, if you fail, I think you will lose about 3 gelts from this. That gelt is sort of like an action points. And from that, you argue down, actually, because of this reason, I think it should only be 2 or something like that. Um, Once you're happy with that, you spin the dreidel. If you get Gimel, which is the one where you take the whole pot in the middle, you succeed. You don't get any consequences from it. You get to keep the 2 gelt that you agreed on. If you get a Hay, which is taking half the pot in the traditional game, you succeed, but you also have the consequence of losing the gelt, and losing it means that you don't have the action points in case you fail, and then you can't take an action from that attribute again. None, which is traditionally do nothing. I think doing nothing in a game design goes against my personal principle of you want the game to always be moving forward.
Right.
Um, you know, there are times for things not moving forward, but I think again, you have one shots that happen very fast. Um, I want every dreidel spin to mean something. So you don't get any consequences. You get to keep the gelt, but the GM gets to decide how that action ends up.
Okay.
And Shin is the one where you have to put something into the center, so it's the worst. You lose the gelt, and
You have a
the
consequence.
GM gets to decide what goes on instead of you deciding
Mm.
what goes on.
And then how would you get Gelth throughout the game?
At the end of every scene, the GM asks a few questions for people on, what did you learn about your character? What did you learn about the world? So you have the collaborative world building not just happen in that phase, but also during the game. And, you reward very clever. Like, I love that about that. We are incorporating that in the next scene.
And it also sounds like it incentivizes people to be a part of the world building,
Mm.
to have their characters undergo development,
Yes.
and to just explore the world, and even potentially to
Yeah.
create problems for their own characters, because, okay, it might come to bite them in the butt later,
Mhm.
but they will also get the gelts, which might help them succeed at other points in the game.
And I think that there are a lot of games that do a lot of things that try to get people to take risks. And I think by giving this like narrative, like, it's a mechanical risk that like you don't really have it until you're done with the scenes and you get to think. And so I think that's my job at trying to do that.
Yeah, which, at least for me, from my standpoint of someone who's
Yeah.
also looking at TTRPGs from a therapeutic standpoint, it's
Yeah.
very interesting having a system that encourages people to take risks.
Mm.
I mean, that's something that I think some articles that I've seen really have utilized, like D&D, for,
Mm.
is helping people to take risky actions, to learn that, like, sometimes they do need to try something even though it might be challenging and even though there might be consequences.
Mhm.
So it definitely does incentivize things in that way. And I would be curious how this would work in kind of a therapeutic environment, because it very much incentivizes that level of like risk taking, but risk taking that comes with like personal character development.
Mm.
And at the same time, as you said, it's mostly developed as more of like a one-shot system, which
Yeah.
I can imagine in a therapeutic field, you probably want to predominantly use more like long-standing systems.
Yes.
But is there a reason that you couldn't use Dybbuks and Dreidels for a more long-standing game?
I find things that are just like a little too rules light, like, all your actions are still coming from those same three attributes.
Mhm.
So maybe you do a system of saying, what did you learn about your character? And like, change up and like, refine your attributes each time. Like, might make it, possible, but I, I just haven't tested it. I think everything that I tell people that the game does, if I'm like writing it down, I want it to be something tested.
Sure.
Yeah.
The immediate,
Yeah.
like, analogy that came to mind for me for whatever reason is, like, Princess Bride, and
Mhm.
if you had, like, one character be like Inigo Montoya, like, one of his attributes would be revenge, and when
Oh,
you get to
absolutely.
the end of Princess Bride, he's kind of accomplished that.
Mhm.
And so if you were to make another story that uses him as a character, you would probably swap out his revenge character attribute for a different type of character attribute.
Absolutely. Burning Wheel does actually a lot of stuff like that. Again, Burning Wheel is a system that mechanizes character growth in some really cool and interesting ways. But in trying to mechanize something as qualitative as character growth, it is like a 600-page rule book, which I love, but it's very hard to get a group of players together for it.
Right. And I guess also to clarify for folks, there isn't really a form of progression in Dybbuks and Dreidels,
Yeah.
like, other than just like the constant flowing of like spending and getting gelt. You don't like level up in the game or anything like
Yeah.
that.
There's no need to put a level up mechanic in something that's made for one shot.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I was going to say, is
Yeah.
usually systems that are better for things like one shots or maybe two shot types games
Yeah.
aren't really going to have that same type of character progression. Is there something like a progressing action or like a doom clock, so to speak, or something like that, that kind of incentivizes the characters to move the plot forward? Or is it mostly entirely motivated by what the players want to happen in the story?
Uh, so one thing that you could do is I was very inspired by the idea of clocks and Forged in the Dark games, in which the GM leaves out, draws a circle divided into certain things. And when you want to like say we're getting closer to it, you put something in it. I decided to say, well, you can make a physical stack of gelts or something like that. So I have these threat stacks, which are mechanically the same thing, but don't feel the same because it's not a clock going towards the end. Um, and that really works if you say like, we have 4 gelt until, the dam breaks and like, the city
Mm.
floods. And then you say, okay, well, can we do something to add more gelt to that? So like, make it so that the, dam come like floods later. Or you could even say, I'm going to brace myself, take all 4 of the gelts from that stack and say, now I have a lot of actions, but the like, dam is going to break.
So how does that work mechanically? Is it basically that a character can spend their gelt to add to the gelt stack so that it takes longer,
Yeah.
or they can choose to like, I'm going to take all of the gelt that is in the stack and like see what happens.
Yes.
But
And then,
now they have all this gelt that they can use for future.
yeah, exactly. And the main use of them is, you spin the dreidel, and it's very hard. Like, if on half the time you're always having the GM decide what the like failure mode is going to be, and you say, what is that? And so having the threat stack allows you to say, oh, okay, you failed that action. Now we get a little bit closer to doom.
At what point does the threat stack diminish?
So, you fail a roll
Mhm.
is like the main way that it diminishes, or, everyone's sitting around and you don't want to use the, oh, do something or else something bad's going to happen. You could just say, oh, as you're deliberating, I'm going to take one off.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is also definitely a sense throughout this game of time really seems to matter.
Yes. But again, the GM rarely spins the dreidel. And that means that all of the actual action that happens is player focused. And a lot of
Mhm.
it is, how do I build. GMing is not necessarily how do I make the best character and roll like, to be combative.
Mhm.
It's how do I build a scene so that every single one of their actions, like, that they have good set pieces to do their actions against.
Right.
Yeah.
And I definitely recall from like play testing
Yeah.
this game, we came up with some really wild and interesting stories that went in all sorts of bizarre directions
Absolutely.
that somehow I think involved my golem character like abandoning his creator at some point and becoming like the apprentice of a witch or something along those
Oh, yes.
lines. And I seem to recall also, so I think from what we've been describing so far, folks might be under the impression that you're only rolling one dreidel at a time.
Yeah. You are when you're taking actions within scene. But to set up the scenes, I think it's just very fun to spin a lot at the same time. So I decided to mechanize that and say, this is how you actually, determine, uh, you know, like, how the beginning of the scene went, because you always start in the middle of them. And it's spin as many as you can. And once one falls down, count off, like, how many successes versus failures you have.
So mechanically speaking, like how do you do scene setting or starting the beginning of the game
Uh,
other than just choosing the three attributes for your character?
Let me, like, actually, I always need to,
Reference your handy dandy notebook.
yeah. I have, just, characters or things in here that like say every single one in very summary forms. So almost every game nowadays has something about safety tools. Safety tools, as you had a video saying, are just saying, what are you comfortable having happen in this or not happen in it? I also think it's important to say, again, this is improvisational. What are you interested in? Also, what would you like to see in it? Would you like this to be funny? Would you like this to be darker? Um, and then you have your big question. What is the one thing we're trying to answer through playing? And then you ask people around the table, what's one fact about the worlds? What's something that's true?
And this big question is this basically acts as the plot thread for the
Yes.
entirety of the
Yeah,
game.
that's the plot thread. Everyone starts thinking of who their character is, what their name is. Very important thing to ask people. Actually name your character. What are the attributes you want to do? How your character actually fits into this world, what's the relation to another character on here. I think having character bonds really encourages that, you're not 5 players, like, 5 characters in their own scenes that just happen to be next to other people, but yeah, a unified world. And if I'm playing with fewer players, I will add one more question of like, what's a major fear or insecurity of their character? And that's so much fun to like, say it's telling the GM what's the thing that you want them to like challenge you with.
Sure.
Yeah.
What is your character flaw, so to
Yes.
speak?
Yeah. And then you start playing in the chapter, you sort of come up with what do we want to do in this? I call them chapters, not scenes. Earlier I did scenes and yeah.
Same difference.
Yes. Yes. That's the hard thing about playing. Sometimes I use the terminology from, 10 playtests ago. Uh, and you say, okay, what do people want to like actually do in this scene? You come up with, here's the opening, thing of like, you are fighting goblins or the dam just burst, and you all say what you're doing, roll the large amount of dreidels, add them up, say, are you succeeding, are you not succeeding, once it already is happening, and then you have a scene to say, okay, what do you do? Yeah, that's a good question to ask on a player facing thing of, here's what's going on, what do you do? Yeah.
It's a very fun time. I would highly suggest it, especially if you're the kind of players who really enjoy the story building aspect of TTRPGs.
Yeah.
If you're more into the crunchy number adding and combat parts, maybe you'll find something that's interesting about this game, but this definitely appeals more to people like me who are very story driven as players and as GMs.
It's just very good. I played with a friend of ours who had only done like the crunchy combat ones. And again, that's very much what he likes doing, but just trying something more on the storytelling side is very good to just understand what you like.
Right. And it also helps people kind of step out of their comfort zone a little
Yeah.
bit. Folks might not realize that they're actually very happy to play other game systems until they're kind of forced into a situation where they need to play a little differently than they normally would. Very cool. So, that being said, is there anything else related to Dybbuks and Dreidels that you feel like?
We'll put a link to where you could buy it in the description down below. You could get it in PDF. You could even get it in a nice bound book. And yeah.
And the other components for the game are pretty easy to obtain. Poker chips are like those little bingo chips, I think, are fairly inexpensive.
Yes.
Index cards, you can get like 100 for a few bucks. Dreidels, pretty inexpensive. Oh, yeah. Also very accessible from a financial standpoint.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking about your very cool game, Matthew.
Thank you.
And I know that you have other games in the pipeline, so I'm sure that we'll have you back at some point in the future to talk about more of the games that you have published.
I'm thinking of starting like my Kickstarter for my next game like pretty soon. So we might also have it link in the description if editing takes long enough.
And also, definitely check out Matthew's game company, Flourish or Fate. And with all that being said, look forward to seeing more of Matthew in the future, and take care, my fellow scholars.